Well, the views of some in Halifax there. I should say that although we approached a number of women for their opinions, none were willing to speak on camera. But I am pleased to say that the journalist Shaista Aziz is here in the studio to discuss some of those issues. And we're also joined by Miqdad Varsi from the Muslim Council of Britain, who's conducted a study into what matters to British Muslims. Thanks both of you for being here with us. Miqdad, first of all, you published a document entitled Fairness Not Favours, a British Muslim perspective of the 2015 general election. Is there a Muslim perspective as opposed to the challenges that all voters face?
I think that's a very fair question. The Muslim community is not homogenous. There's a very big diversity of opinion. There's some from a socio-economic perspective, from an ethnic perspective, a lot of challenges are facing all people across the country. But what is important is that specific issues are relevant to the Muslim community more than others. And for example, Islamophobia. That's something that is considered to be a worry for the Muslim community, perhaps more than others. But the reality is that the main issues that bind the Muslim community together are about fairness and not favours. And that's what the document talks about.
Shaista, do you agree with that? I mean, is it things like Islamophobia that is at the forefront of people's, or a lot of people who you talk to, their minds, or is it the economy, health, education, all those sorts of things? I mean, how do you view this election?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that British Muslims are part of wider Britain. We're very much part of this society. We're very much part of the DNA of the United Kingdom. So for me, I don't think there is a Muslim vote. I think Muslims, like the wider population, are concerned about issues around employment, around housing, about the austerity measures that have been taken, which have really impacted communities. Clearly, Islamophobia is on the rise. There is plenty of studies, plenty of statistics that show that across Europe there is a growing fear and animosity towards Muslims. But this is not just an issue that impacts Muslims. This should be impacting every single person living in Europe.
Miqdad, I've got here, you produced a document with 10 of the top things that Muslims want to see from their prospective MPs at this election. Just for our viewers who haven't got it in front of me, just briefly, what sort of things are we talking about? Because it slightly differs to what we just heard there.
I think there is actually a lot of overlap as well. I mean, when it comes to the economy, whether social inequality, for example, that Shaista was mentioning right now, it impacts the Muslim community perhaps more than the wider community, because 50% of Muslims live in the 10% most deprived areas. So obviously social inequality is going to play a major role in determining some people's votes.
You have, as number 2, defend the right of Muslims and people of all faiths to live their faith, with religious clothing, food, reasonable accommodation. You talk about communities having to rebuild trust on issues like terrorism. Implicit in that, does that mean that the trust has been breached?
I think that there is a lot of work that needs to be done to build the trust with the Muslim community when it comes to the government and in general. What happens when the community feels disengaged when it comes to the political spectrum, then there is a problem. And in particular when it comes to counter-terrorism, what we want is engagement on equal footing as equal members of society.
But it's interesting, I was sort of glancing down the 10 and I watched every minute of the leaders' debate with all those 7 leaders and all the other debates, and actually very little of this was included in those debates.
I think
Has that disappointed you?
To some extent, it would be nice to have some of these mentioned, but the reality is a significant proportion of the Muslim community's concerns are broader concerns, as Shaista mentioned, to do with the economy, to do with housing, for example. The issues that are mentioned here are also ones that affect the Muslim community, and when the Muslim community engages with politicians, these are some of the issues that might be specifically brought up. But in a broader society, when there's only 5% of the population who are Muslims, obviously you wouldn't expect these to be a major part of those discussions.
Do you think that there's been enough engagement with the sorts of issues that you want to hear your political leaders addressing?
I think generally the discourse around this election has been quite poor. We keep hearing about immigration, we keep hearing about these big issues without actually getting into the nitty-gritty of what it means. And I think that's been disappointing. I mean, I think it's very important to note that David Cameron has visited temples, as he rightly should have done. He's visited Sikh community, etc. But he's distanced himself quite considerably from the Muslim community, which I think is worrying. And I don't think something like that should be happening. You mentioned earlier on about the whole issue of, well, we talked about Islamophobia, discrimination, racism, all these issues, you can't avoid them anymore. They're very stark. They're growing, and these are definitely issues that concern not only Muslims but the wider population
Just
too.
a final quick thought, because only a couple of weeks ago we were looking at black and Asian sections of the voting community and whether they voted, whether they didn't vote. Is there any sort of empirical evidence about how Muslims in Britain vote, whether they
Well,
meet
people in
the
Britain
averages
don't vote.
or don't meet the averages?
But I think the issue is voter turnout. I mean, in the last election, voter turnout was poor. It's going to be very interesting to see who turns out to vote this time round. We know there's a whole group of people, a whole swathe of people who feel disengaged from British politics. It's not just Muslims.
No.
And I think at the moment the stats that come out are about 50% of the British Muslim population voted in the last election compared to an average of about 65. And I think that there is a work that has been done over the last 5 years, and we do hope that there will be increased engagement and increased participation in this election.
So slightly beneath the average, but you're hoping perhaps to nudge that up this time around?
Yes, very much so. I think that we are faced between a rock and a hard place. You have some people on the right wing talking about any Muslim participation being a negative and a worry, and Muslims are taking over. You have that perspective, and that's something that obviously holds things back. And what we're going to do is increase turnout.
Well, listen, we've run out of time, but thank you so much for joining us and discussing that.